I just said okay. Yeah.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gabby. I am the Training Associate at Waterkeeper Alliance. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar, Beyond Bag Bans, Opportunities for Advocacy to Reduce Plastic Pollution. Presenting with us today is Heather Trim, the Executive Director of Zero Waste Washington, and Chris Wilkie, the Global Advocacy Manager at Waterkeeper Alliance. We're going to get started shortly, but first I just want to let you know that today we will be recording the webinar. And so if you have to leave early or anything, I will be sending out the presentation and the recording by the end of the day. We will be taking questions throughout, but only clarifying questions. So if you have something that you're confused about, you can write it in the questions box and I will be moderating that. If not, we'll be taking all questions at the end of the presentation. And you can either write your question in the question box or raise your hand and I will momentarily unmute you. You will be able to reach out to the presenters if you have any questions. I'll be sharing their emails and their email is in the presentation. And if you have any problems with hearing or anything, you can write something at the chat box, which I'll also be moderating. So we're going to start with 2 polls and then I will hand it over to Chris Wilkie to present. First poll, I will launch right now. What region of the US are you currently located in? I'll wait a second for people to answer. Okay, just a couple more seconds. And I'm going to close that up. So you should all be able to see the results. All right, and I have a second poll. So everyone look out for this one. How much experience have you had with plastics advocacy? And I'll just give you a couple more seconds again. Okay, and looks like almost everyone has answered. So I'm going to close up this poll. All right, and now I'm going to hand it over to Chris Wilkie. Chris, are you ready to share?
Yes, I am.
All right, 1 second. Okay, here you go.
Hopefully everyone can see my screen now. And for some reason the slide's not advancing. There it goes. Okay, so I'm the one on the right. I'm Chris Wilkie. I am the Global Advocacy Manager for Waterkeeper Alliance, and I live in Washington State, where I formerly worked with the Puget Sound Keeper as the Executive Director there. And I had the good pleasure of working for the last 10 years with my friend Heather Trim, who is at Zero Waste Washington. So there's Heather. You say hi, Heather.
Hey everyone. Good morning and good afternoon.
Yeah. Yeah, we had a chance to work together on a number of bills and regulations and everything to protect the Puget Sound in what you may know as the other Washington. But we call it the Washington. The goals of our presentations today are really to expand our vision about what we can collectively do to protect our planet from plastic pollution, looking at specific advocacy opportunities, exploring upstream and downstream solutions, but also really looking at this in the context of the petrochemical industry's plans for expansion and their current use of disinformation. We'll touch on all those things. We won't have a lot of time to go into anything too deep, but it's our goal that this will inspire ideas that you can work in your state or in your jurisdiction to move forward. The other thing I'd just like to add is there's a lot on the table with regard to plastics advocacy, and there's a lot of conversations about where to put the emphasis on getting off of plastic, to improve recycling, a lot of these things. And I would strongly advocate an all of the above approach. There's a lot of different solutions, and we need to be working together and supporting each other as much as possible. And then before I hand it over to Heather, I just want to frame the context here that really what we're talking about with advocacy is we're talking about making interventions. We have a plastic pollution crisis on this planet. There's a lot of people are focusing on individual solutions, and those are great. But advocacy is really about collective action, and ultimately we are looking for systemic change. So we really need to be thinking in that concept. Yes, we're not rejecting individual actions. Yes, we are supporting that, but ultimately what we're looking for is systemic change. And then different types of interventions, behavior change, stewardship activities. But mostly with advocacy, we're going to be focusing on the last two here, looking at corporate responsibility and government and policy change. It doesn't change the value of any of the other ones. Okay, and we already conducted our poll, so I'm going to skip this slide. And we'll hand it over to Heather Trim.
Great. Okay, thanks, Chris. And if you can advance the slides for me, that'd be great. So if you can go to the next slide. So I'm Executive Director of Zero Waste Washington, and just a quick thing about us, we are a statewide nonprofit working to make trash obsolete, and we do this primarily by trying to pass state, local, and helping with federal laws, and then conducting research and doing pilot projects. Next slide. So just a quick refresher, I know most of you know this already, so this is going to be super quick. This is a terrific slide, though, that for you to grab and use from Geyer et al., showing the exponential increase in the use of plastics globally from 1950 to 2015. And interestingly, you can see the recession pops up in the mid-2000s. The bottom is packaging, the blue. Next slide. And so 30 to 40% of plastics are used for packaging, and that is everything from bags and bottles, but also the wrap around your toilet paper, your candy wrapper, and even the little sticker on your veggie. The definition of packaging is a very large definition. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about laws as starting out, and I'm giving examples from Washington State, but my hope is that these will be applicable to your own locations, and many of you may have already been working on some of these in your own locations. Next slide. So there's basically, we have two crises. We have the plastics crisis and we have a recycling crisis going on in the U.S. And our general strategy is, one, to do policy that reduces the use of unnecessary plastics, but then secondarily, for the plastics that we do have in everyday use, to build markets and restore the recycling system, creating jobs in Washington, creating jobs elsewhere. The point is that we're not getting rid of the recycling system, but if we're going to have recycling, let's make it actually work well and be optimized. Next slide. So just starting with bags, I know that we're not going to mainly talk about bags here, but just to do the bags quickly. There are now 8 states that have statewide bag bills in place, and those are the ones that are in green on this map, including Hawaii, where each of the counties has a bag ordinance in place. The purple are where you have city and county ordinances in place. And notice that the territories have all addressed plastic bags already. I use this all the time for legislators. Like, hello, the territory is doing it. How about us? Next slide. So in Washington, we are working on a reusable bag bill. It has passed the Senate, and it's going to be heard tomorrow in the House Environment Committee. So it's now going through the House process. We're hoping that this will pass this year. We started this last year. Next slide. The gist of it is no thin plastic carry-home film bags. These are the T-shirt bags. Next slide. And that there would be an 8-cent pass-through charge on paper bags and 2.25 mil thick plastic bags. A mil is a thousandth of an inch. And the store will keep the 8 cents. The reason that the 8 cents is important in our case, or 10 cents in other states or other numbers, is because A, it's a motivator to get people to bring their own bag, but also the cost of paper bags has dramatically increased in the last 10 years. It now costs between 10.5 and 12.5 cents for the independent grocers in Washington state to get the paper bags. So it's a very large increase. The thin little T-shirt bags, those cost between 1 and 3 cents each. Next slide. And the goal is for people to bring their own bags so they would pay no charge. Next slide. So that was bags, and let's move on to food service products, which is sort of the bane of our existence in this world. Next slide. So this is a similar map, but now I'm just showing the 3 states, Maine, Vermont, and Maryland, that in 2019 passed styrofoam bans. And we are working on that now in Washington and hopefully some of the other states as well. Next slide. So the bill we're doing is led by, again, Senator Doss, and that's the bill that is moving forward at the moment, and it passed the Senate Monday. Next slide. It would, in our case, ban expanded polystyrene, which is the proper name for styrofoam, food service products, and you can see examples on the left there, coolers, and packing peanuts. The coolers are the ones that are more the recreational ones. It would exempt the coolers used for medical, transport of medical, like blood and medical devices. And it would only be the packing peanuts. It's not the rigid packaging. We tried that initially, but that dropped out of the bill relatively quickly in the bill. The other thing that's going to be exempt in our bill is meat trays, styrofoam meat trays. We wanted it, but it was too heavy a lift for this year. And prepackaged food like your ramen noodles, that would be exempt as well. Next slide. Another really cool bill that we have going, and it's actually doing very well, is related to recycled content. This is HB 2722, and it passed the House last Saturday and is moving into the Senate. Next slide. The deal is this: all these major brands like Nestle, PepsiCo, Evian, Coke, and Naked have made big pledges and commitments that they're going to use recycled content in their bottles. But what is super interesting is that they're making stronger commitments and pledges for Europe than they are for America. It's really weird and interesting to see that. So this bill sort of basically kind of codifies it for here. And then I'd like to point out that Naked is already 100% recycled content. Next slide. So why is this important? Right now, where does the recycled PET plastic bottles go? Interestingly, 45% is going to fiber. So that's where they shred it up and put it, for example, in pillows or make clothing out of it. 12% for thermoforms, only 30% to bottles, and other is 12%. Next slide. And this is from a Canadian presentation, so you can see that they have Ice River Springs, which is a Canadian brand, is 100% recycled plastic. But this gives you an idea of the other ones: Nestle, Pepsi, Coke, and Pepsi in Europe. Notice it's higher, and then the Canadian average. Next slide. So why is this an issue? What happened is in 2019, it looks like it was in May of 2019, the price of recycled PET dropped or became higher than the price of virgin. So this is the thing that is basically in the last 10 years, this is when finally we've had this flip in the price, in the value. We're trying to drive the value of recycled material up. Next slide. And this is showing the same thing, just showing it in a different graphical format. And then next slide. This shows what's happened. What's happened is we've had a boom in fracking in the United States that has led to a glut of gas and oil. And that's what you make ethane out of in order to make PET, the plastic you need for bottles. And so you can see that from 2012, just from 2012 to 2020, you see the incredible increase in the amount of U.S. production. This is causing, as you all know, a driver for like, okay, we need to figure out what to do with these plastics, this virgin material. Let's make plastic instead of oil for fuel, which you can, as you know, all the climate change bills are helping address. Next slide. So in addition to that driver that we're trying to make the recycled resin more valuable, another point of this bill is that if you do recycled rather than virgin material, you do have significant greenhouse gases saved in the production of the bottles. So you can see PET, which is what you make these #1 bottles out of. You have HDPE in the middle, which is like the milk jugs, and polypropylene, which are other plastic items. You can see a dramatic difference between the two, what the source material is. Next slide. So this bill in Washington is based off of the bill that passed in California last year. This is a guy testifying during the California process last year. The governor vetoed the bill, and the reason is because in the very end, industry came in with amendments that were basically poison pill amendments. So where we're at on our Washington bill is we have a little bit of what the industry wants in there, but it's primarily a really good bill, and it's so far holding tight. And we're hoping to pass it, and then we're hoping that other states, including California, will do even better than us, and then maybe some of the states you're in as well. Next slide. Okay, moving on to another plastics issue, which you may not have thought that much about, and that is wipes. So we're talking about diaper wipes, makeup wipes, cleansers. And the issue is that the disposable wipes are made of material that is not plastic, but it doesn't break down very well. Next slide. So this is from Orange County in LA. You can see toilet paper well broken down, and you can see flushable wipes not breaking down very well. They're made of sort of a cellulose and some other materials. They're not plastic per se. But the problem is the consumer is confused. They now think that all wipes are flushable, so just the ones that aren't marked not flushable are flushable, and those are made of plastic. So what we're doing is we're both putting flushable wipes down the drain, which don't fall apart, but then we're also putting down plastic ones, which really don't break down, and this is causing a major problem. Next slide. This is just from here in Washington State, but you're going to have the same thing all over the U.S. and the world. So this was an overflow, a sewage overflow that occurred last summer, and it was because of baby wipes. It's nice and disgusting, this photo. Next slide. The thing is that when you go to the store, you see moist, flushable wipes, and this is like big headlines on these boxes, but then right next to them, next slide, you have the ones that are not flushable, but the consumer just can't tell. So what this bill will do is it requires labeling of the boxes like this. A huge label will be required on here that says this is not flushable, and it will have a big logo on it. Now, we would have liked to have had a stronger bill, not just a labeling bill, that would address the composition of the flushable wipes. So again, we're hoping other states will one-up us on that. Next slide. A really cool bill that is groundbreaking, if this passes, is having to do with the water rights for commercial bottled water production. And this bill did make it out of the Senate, more or less on lines last weekend, and is headed to the House here in Washington. Next slide. And the deal is this. There's a community, a rural community in Washington, Randall, that has Crystal Geyser coming in wanting to do a big bottled water facility. They are up in arms, and they are the instigator of this bill in the first place. But this is something in my 20 years working in Washington State, I've had 3 different times when I've had to be fighting companies coming in. One time it was Nestle, and I'm sure you all have had the same situation in other parts of the U.S. There is no state right now that has a bill like this in place, so we're hoping it'll pass, and we're hoping other states will do as well. What it says is that bottled water, commercial bottled water, would not be allowed as a water right in Washington. And what the water will be allowed for are things like irrigation, recreation, the tap water, your regular drinking water, and fish, and the fish, of course. So this is a really big deal bill. I hope it passes because it seems like a no-brainer from some perspectives, but you can imagine the opposition on this. Okay, next slide. So another major area, in addition to just reducing the plastics in the first place and that kind of thing, is doing plastic packaging stewardship. And the goal of this is to build markets, restore the recycling system, and create jobs. And I'm going to explain what this means in the next few slides. This is our big deal bill, and we are aiming for this to occur next year. And I'll explain, we had another bill last year that became a study bill. Next slide. So this bill and this approach is built off a very successful product stewardship program that's in British Columbia right now, but also all around Europe and in other countries as well. In the Recycle BC program, they have a 75% recovery rate of packaging materials. That's from 2017. And when China's sword hit with the restrictions of imports of the waste to China, they had much less of an impact than we've had in the United States because they already had very clean materials. Their bales of recyclables were very clean, and they had things well sorted, and they had good markets. Next slide. So the goal of this bill is that the manufacturers and the brand owners will pay for a recycling program that manages plastic packaging at the end of life. They pay in based on, in the British Columbia system, they pay in based on the weight of the different types of packaging that they're putting into the system, and they pay more if the material is not recyclable. And in this example here, the photo, you can see these pouches that are being used now for baby food. And those pouches are multiple materials and are not recyclable. So they would pay, in British Columbia, they pay double into the system for those because those are not currently recyclable. Next slide. The goal is to use the existing collection system and recycling facilities. This is important because we're trying to stabilize and not disrupt the job situation, but we are also trying to make it a much more coherent system statewide. Next slide. And part of it is to incentivize domestic remanufacture. This is a slide of a glass manufacturer in Seattle that is making wine bottles for both California and Washington from recycled glass. We want more of this domestically in the United States. Next slide. And the fundamental issue is that we're shifting the cost of the end of life of these materials from the ratepayer back to the manufacturer and incentivizing them to have less material, have better material, easy to recycle, and to have a better system that basically means things are truly being recycled, everything. Next slide. So the bill we passed last year is 5397, and it became, we brought it in as a huge bill, but we knew it was going to become a study bill. So it's a 2-year study that's looking at sort of the data for Washington State in terms of the costs of the system right now and things like that, the volumes. And then next year in 2021, we plan to come back with a very big, strong bill, and we have a wonderful champion who we think is going to be able to help push this. And I know that in Maine, they're also working on a very similar bill. They've had very good progress so far. So Maine will probably be the first state in the country to have a program like this. Next slide. So other solutions besides these regulatory policy solutions. Next. One thing we would really love to address are single-use water bottles, but the plastic water bottles. The problem is that we, because of Flint, Michigan, people are very concerned about lead, and it's so hard to legislate we're going to ban water bottles at this point. So we have other strategies in mind. Next slide. This is from Costco, just the pile of it, and people, it's convenience. People are worried about the safety of their water, and it's just sort of becoming ingrained in our lifestyles here in America. Next slide. So what we're doing is we're promoting refill stations, and we're also promoting online apps where people can, businesses can sign up to let people refill their water bottles for free. So we're trying to change the norm right now so that we can get to the point of doing regulatory change. We're also right now advocating that the Port of Seattle, which is the airport in Seattle, go to banning single-use plastic water bottles like San Francisco did. So getting institutions, universities, public places, cities as a whole, and then things like airports. That's kind of where we're at right now, and hope that you guys can do the same where you are. Next slide. So another big area, and this is the last thing I'm going to talk about, is the issue of being able to bring your own container. This slide shows that for food. So in Washington State right now, and in most of the United States, it is illegal to bring your own container to a grocery store and get the bulk food or to bring it back to a restaurant. This is not known by many people, and most of the restaurants and grocers just ignore it and don't really enforce it. But we are trying to get this to actually be formally allowed in Washington, in our case, through the state Department of Health food safety regulations. But in California, they did it by passing a state law. So there's different levels you can do this at. In our case, we don't have to go to a law. They were in the process of updating their food safety regs, and we were able to kind of insert into that. So this is the current draft language. This is going to go out for public comment this summer and then hopefully get formalized by the fall. But it would allow consumers to bring their own consumer-owned container and fill it themselves with non-ready-to-eat food, so in other words, rice that hasn't been cooked yet, bulk food and packaged food, and also ready-to-eat food when it's coming from a gravity flow unit, and then they will have to request an employee to fill it if it's food like teriyaki or salad bar. Unfortunately, we can't go so far as to let the customer fill their own when it's a salad bar, because the main thing about the food safety regs is about cross-contamination. And it's hard to have a salad bar that you couldn't accidentally touch your container with the tongs or the spoon that you're using to put stuff into your container. Next slide. So that was food. This is beverages. So right now, the only thing you're allowed to bring your own container for is coffee, hot beverages that don't have any milk. This would allow it for all beverages, and it could either be the employee or the consumer who could refill, as long as it's a contamination-free process. In other words, like a spout or a spigot or something coming down from above. Next slide. So overall, I'm sure you all seen this. We're trying to follow the waste prevention and reduction hierarchy. So prevention, number one, bring your own bag, bring your own bottle. Reuse, recycling. We are very, very much a dead set against recovery, which is basically incineration. We put our dead bodies in front of a bulldozer if that happens. And then, of course, disposal is the landfill. Next slide. So that was my last slide, and I'm happy to take any clarifying questions now or wait for discussion at the end.
Okay, I see no questions as of right now. So I'm going to go ahead and share our poll. So what is your area of greatest interest in terms of plastics? I'll give everyone a minute to respond to that. And just a couple more seconds. Okay, and I'm going to close this up and share the results. Here you go. And Chris, I'm going to unmute you. I just want to let you know there was a bit of background noise before, so just be aware of that. But I will turn it over to you.
Yeah, I don't think the background noise was coming from me because I was sitting pretty quietly, but there is a cat outside that wants to come in, so you might hear that. Okay, so moving on. Gabby, I'm not able to advance the slide. There we go. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Wilkie. I'm the Global Advocacy Manager at Waterkeeper Alliance. Most of my work is actually focused on international topics, working with our waterkeepers around the world. We have 350 member groups. Some of them are probably on this call. And in the area of plastics, I have been a little more involved domestically as well. The idea with this presentation is to really explore the ends of this of the plastic. They use the word life cycle, but it's neither alive nor is it normally even a cycle. So, so we're going to explore some of the other opportunities. I'm not going to go into as much detail as Heather did. Thank you so much, Heather. That was incredible information. But I'm going to really talk about the petrochemical industry in various ways that it impacts. So the thing to think about with plastics is you really cannot think of it separately than petrochemicals and oil and gas. Looks like we have a formatting issue on this slide. I apologize for that. But essentially, across the life cycle, oil, gas, fracking, refining, it all comes into play. And the thing that the industry is facing right now is they are actually on the precipice of seeing a decline in the use of fossil fuels for energy for the first time in history. And they're concerned about their existential survival. And so they are putting their hopes in plastics. I think it's really important to keep that in mind because we are now understand that there are proposals for 300 new projects around the US to expand the processing of petrochemicals that will be used to create plastics. So particularly what they refer to as ethane cracker plants. Those are expected to increase by, or not, they are proposed to increase by 35% by the year 2025. So that's just around the corner. So this is what we're dealing with. We need to find ways to oppose that. And here is just one analysis of the life cycle. Like I said, it's neither alive nor a cycle, but we still use that. But the thing to bear in mind is that plastic pollutes all at every stage of this. So the extraction, we need to better regulate fracking and drilling, banning it in many cases. Look at the refining, transport, especially the export of the precursor chemicals for producing plastics. Actually producing the pellets, the nurdles that are used to produce products have a tendency to get away from manufacturers, and they pollute the environment with those solid pellets. We just heard a lot of different aspects of incentivizing and regulating consumer demand. And it's really nice to see a lot of that advancing. Other efforts on behavior change, as well as regulations. We need to look at that. Also, Heather covered some of the end-of-life planning. That's really important because, again, plastic pollutes at every stage. We also need to be doing the work in environmental and assessment, understanding the microplastic concentrations in the environment and what those impacts are, and then where possible, clean it up. But I think there's a pretty good consensus that the problem that's in the oceans right now is beyond our ability to respond. And we do cleanups, but I'm convinced we're still putting more plastics into the environment every day than we are cleaning up. And that's not a winning equation. So we need to control it at every stage. So that really kind of informs how we laid out the next presentation. But it's really, as we begin advocacy campaigns, it's really important to think about who the decision makers are. And the decision makers may vary according to what it is that we're addressing. So we might be concerned about the fossil fuel industry's expansion plans, but we're not going to convince them to not expand. But we might be able to convince the permitting agencies to restrict new facilities from coming online, for example, and to look at the overwhelming public interest versus one company's quest for profit. So, so it's really important to think about who it is that we're actually trying to influence. Are we trying to reject a new permit for a new facility? Are we looking for enforcement agencies to do their job in enforcing the laws? Are we looking for them to issue new regulations? Are we looking for the courts to enforce compliance? So it's one thing to have these laws, but there's a broad consensus from those working in the industry that that they're just not being held they're not being held to account for compliance. So we need to bring cases to enforce Clean Water Act and laws like that. Of course, consumers have a lot of input, so they can be a target audience. There is even opportunities within corporations. Some corporations really do want to implement voluntary measures, looking at end of use, promoting reuse and that kind of thing. And then of course, legislators, whether those be at the municipal, state, or federal level. So what I'm going to discuss now is just real briefly different opportunities for intervention at different stages of the life cycle. So we're going to start with extraction. So, you know, one of the really important things here is to focus on the needs of the water body and to protect water. So if you're talking about any sort of drilling or fracking, you're going to be concerned about surface water quality, but also groundwater protection. You may be looking at saving wild spaces from exploitation. You may also find really strong arguments for protecting indigenous uses of the land. We've seen some horrible proposals that would really impact traditional fishing, food gathering, and sites of cultural importance. And I just want to point out that aligning with indigenous groups, treaty tribes, First Nations is really important, but it's also important to understand what their needs are and including their voice. And then not everyone's favorite topic, but I will just point this out: in improving spill prevention and response capability, even methane capture. A lot of people want to see us getting off oil, so they don't want to see oil being made safer. But consider the impacts of an oil spill, like what we saw in the Gulf 10 years ago. It would be the worst day ever for your water body. And more effective spill prevention and response does put the true cost of working with these chemicals, petrochemicals, onto the producers. Okay, moving to the next stage, refining. Improving standards for regulations on cracker facilities. These are the ethane plants. There was a petition going around last summer that was sponsored by the Center for Biological Diversity. It was quite detailed about the impacts and asking the EPA to consider the full impact of these facilities, not just their own discharges, but the global plastic crisis that we are experiencing and what the role of more production would mean for that. Looking at Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act compliance for a lot of these facilities, you know, not letting facilities violate the law with impunity, but looking at opportunities for citizen enforcement, especially with the Clean Water Act. You can also look at toxic releases, a community right to know. This isn't so much a compliance issue, but it is a transparency. It's no surprise that refining facilities are often located in environmental justice communities, communities that have historically been disenfranchised from power and lack the socioeconomic opportunity of others, and they're being subjected to the toxic pollution, often without widespread knowledge. So daylighting that, showing where the cancer hotspots are, their proximity to refineries and things like that. This is all part of the plastic pollution crisis that we are experiencing. And then looking at expanding refining infrastructure. So, and really opposing that whenever we can. We don't need more oil and gas in this country. We are getting ourselves off of it, and plastics should not be a solution for a dying industry. Taking it one step further, after these chemicals have been brought out of the ground and refined, there are many risks associated with transportation and transshipping of these pipelines, and in particular export terminals. My old organization, Puget Soundkeeper, along with some other allies here in Washington, had a successful case to stop an export facility of xylenes, which would have exported 60 full ocean-going tankers full of xylene, which was extracted from gasoline at an oil refinery. And as a result of the advocacy and several layers of court cases, they were able to negotiate an end to that proposal with the company. So you can win some of these fights, and it's really gratifying to know that that you're reducing the sheer magnitude of the chemicals that are being used to produce these plastics. And ultimately, there's a big carbon footprint to a lot of this as well. You know, I even heard people making the argument that plastics was a form of carbon sequestration. It does not work that way. These virgin plastics has a huge carbon footprint. In one case, the facility, the carbon footprint would have exceeded that of every motor vehicle in the county. So that they do have a very large carbon footprint as well. And then I won't dwell too much on this because we covered a lot of this in the last presentation, and I think a lot of you are familiar with it. But there are some opportunities down towards the bottom here, encouraging institutions, agencies, companies that hold events to make them zero waste events, making school lunches plastic free. These are options for collective action, even if they are voluntary. Here we go. Ultimately, we do need to get more products designed with proper end-of-use planning. This can come down to standardized recycling labels, standards, policies around recycling and ways to regulate it. I can tell you this is working with an organization that enforces the Clean Water Act. A number of the dirtiest facilities we ever saw were recycling facilities. And these are facilities that were held in very high regard by a lot of people because they considered an environmental benefit. But the facilities themselves can be horrible polluters. So recycling facilities definitely need to manage their own footprint. And of course, the type of processing that we're seeing occurring in developing countries, particularly in Asia, is just horrific conditions, as you can see in the slide there. Moving on, looking at environmental assessment. We need to keep doing the work on what is ending up in the environment, what are those impacts, how is it affecting wildlife, how is it affecting human health, what are the vectors and sources. This is the area that I'm particularly interested in. Is if we know plastic is bad, we know it's getting into the environment, we know about the garbage patches in the ocean, but what are the particular vectors that are causing leakage, as they say, and how is it getting into the environment? And as we work to get ourselves off of single-use plastics, what particular brands or products or sources are getting into the environment? So in particular, efforts to understand those can be very important. And then it's also interesting to understand how the Clean Water Act works for a waterway impairment. So in the US, when a waterway is no longer supporting its designated uses, which includes fishing and swimming and drinking, it's eligible to be classified as an impaired waterway on something called the 303D list. And then it's incumbent on the agencies to develop something called a total maximum daily load to control that particular pollutant. And this is something that was done successfully on the LA River with plastic pollution. I believe it was the first time ever that a river was considered impaired for plastic pollution. But we know this is happening everywhere. So I think that's a big opportunity for further study. And then also looking at the impacts of disposal and recycling and ways that we can improve those so that there's less leakage going into the environment. And this is actually another area that is not an end in itself, but I think it really, it shows you what we are up against. Going back to the original Keep America Beautiful campaign in the 1970s, which was designed to expose, or it was designed to alert people to the problems going on with the environment and the problems of littering, probably did encourage people to not litter, but in so doing, it was really putting the responsibility back onto the consumer and totally exonerating the companies that were pushing these products out, these forever products made of plastic. So, and we're seeing efforts that continuing today, like bottling companies that are sponsoring school recycling competitions and that kind of thing. There's a subliminal message there that this is all your fault. If you guys would just stop littering, it wouldn't be a problem. And you know, we're never going to stop the plastic pollution crisis by putting it on school children and asking them to recycle more. So really exposing the industry's efforts to and calling out the worst polluters and exposing the money trail for who's paying for these anti-littering ads. We also want to be really skeptical when we see major win-win propositions that are proposed that you know, particularly waste to energy, that don't even fully disclose or evaluate the toxic impacts of the discharges. Next couple of slides are going to have two columns. More intervention opportunities here, but looking at corporate responsibility, the different things that they can be doing, corporations, in order to help the plastic pollution crisis, and then the various tactics that NGOs can use. Sometimes we might want to be in a cooperative partnership, or we may want to be putting market pressure on them, or doing boycotts or corporate shaming, escalating all the way up to environmental law enforcement. So there are different tactics that we can use in order to get the results that we need. And then also looking at the same thing with government policies. So we can look at labeling requirements, single-use plastic bans, methodology that incentivizes circular economy, but then we can look at our various tactics that we have available. So legislation, engaging in regulatory processes, and also contributing to the thought leadership that informs future policies. So we're getting to the end, and we'd like to open up for a discussion. Before I go to that, though, again, I work with Waterkeeper Alliance. I'm really proud of a lot of the work that waterkeepers have done. Of course, there's a number of victories and good work being done all across the country and all around the world. But these are some of the successes that different waterkeepers have had. New York State bag ban, styrofoam ban in Maryland. And I would also like to call out our San Antonio Bay Estuarine waterkeeper, Diane Wilson. I don't know if you're on the call, Diane, but she actually won a major case against Formosa Plastics for Clean Water Act enforcement. In fact, it is the largest settlement ever. It's a $50 million settlement that had to do with the industrial pollution at this plastics facility, including nurdles that were going out into the bay. And her work was featured in the movie Story of Plastic, which is out now, that I encourage everyone to see. Although I think the movie was produced before she completely won her case. So anyway, those are some of the work that's being done with waterkeepers around the country and around the world. I also wanted to not steal all the thunder, but Alex Truelove with US PIRG is going to be doing the next webinar, and I don't have the date for that yet, but maybe someone will on the call when we open this up. But a bill was introduced on February 11th that is the most comprehensive federal plastics legislation, and we're going to have a webinar next month to discuss that in detail. But just to cover just a couple of the bullets, it really expands producer responsibility, nationwide container refunds, phasing out various single-use plastics, instituting a carry-out bag fee, looking at recycled content, standardized labels, and also really looking at the global problem of plastic waste, and that we can't just make a recycling container, accept people's waste, ship it to a developing nation and say, there, we recycled it. So really looking at preventing shipping of our plastic waste to countries that are not set up to deal with it. There's a number of other elements. I encourage everyone to take a good look at it and to tune in for the next webinar with Alex from US PIRG. And so with that, concluded my presentation, and I guess we would like to open up for questions and a discussion.
Thank you so much, Chris and Heather. This is Gabby speaking. Just a reminder, we are actually really short on time, so we might only have time to get to one question, but I will be sending out an email with this recording and the slides, as well as Chris and Heather's email address, so you can either send them questions directly or you can send them to me and I can forward them. So I'll just quickly read some questions we have. Yeah, I think we only have time for one question, so apologies to anyone, but we can answer your questions. So Yuval is asking if you can elaborate a little on efforts and advocacy on plastics in beaches and the ocean in general. I think this is geared towards you, Chris.
Okay, efforts and advocacy. Well, a lot of attention is paid to ocean plastic. It tends to get more of the press, international press, than other types of pollution. But I can tell you, our rivers are often horrible dumping grounds as well, and a lot of stuff goes into rivers that are not seen by the broader community. So I think we have to consider that our rivers are part of this equation. There was a study that came out that showed that 93% of the ocean plastic was coming from 10 rivers worldwide. So that is a very alarming statistic. And it also presents an opportunity because our rivers are, in a sense, point sources of and pollution vectors for polluting our beaches and our oceans. So if we can protect our rivers, we will deal with a lot of the waste that's moving its way out to the sea. Of course, environmental cleanup is one popular solution. It's something that almost everyone can participate in, is finding a local beach cleanup, cleaning things up, using those as educational opportunities and showing how that this is one step, but here's another step that you can take. You can sign on to support this Break Free from Plastic Act, for example. So using those beach cleanups as a conversation starter, using the images like this image in this picture right here of a seahorse holding onto a plastic swab. Using the images from the ocean really tells the story in a way that we may be unable to do otherwise. So being able to look at that, understanding the role of plastic pollution, but ultimately, I think we really need to get down to source control. We are not going to be able to clean up this problem fast enough, and we may be spinning in circles trying to clean up the oceans and still putting in more plastic every day than we are taking out. So it is a crisis. Some countries are really waking up. China is getting to work on this. They are ahead of the U.S. in a lot of ways, but they also lack some of the infrastructure, so they are still putting a lot of plastic into the ocean. But working with the international community and learning lessons and I think are all solutions, but it really comes down to source control in my view.
Great, thank you, Chris. I'm going to read just one last question. Heather, I believe this is for you. Taylor is asking, does the Washington state ban that's currently being considered include a fee exemption for SNAP and participants?
Yes. So our bag bill does include an exemption for anyone who is from the charge, from anyone who's on a food assistance program, and all of our local ordinances do that as well. And I think most of the ones across the country do have that in there.
Okay, great. Thank you so much to everyone who joined this webinar. And again, thank you, Chris and Heather, for such an excellent overview of this topic. Again, I'll be sending out an email, so if you have any other questions, feel free to ask them. And appreciate everyone's attendance. All right, bye.
Thanks, everyone.